In a Stanford University dorm room at 11:47 p.m., an 18-year-old linguistics student was about to face the most important test of her life. What started as a late-night cramming session for her ancient languages final took a shocking turn when armed Navy SEALs burst through her door. Victoria Chen wasn't your typical college freshman. For 10 years, she had spent her life mastering languages that most scholars took decades to understand. Known for her unprecedented ability to decode any written communication within hours. When she encountered Commander Jake Morrison demanding she abandon her textbooks for a classified mission, she had no idea she was walking into a conspiracy that threatened thousands of lives. Victoria's decision to leave everything behind would lead to her becoming the Pentagon's most valuable asset in preventing a coordinated terrorist attack. What began as finals week would become a deadly game of international espionage. The nation's security would hang in the balance as this brilliant young woman discovered that some knowledge comes with an unbearable price. The linguistic prodigy who just wanted to pass her exams was about to learn that exceptional talent makes you indispensable, whether you want to be or not. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The ancient Sumerian cuneiform seemed to pulse and shift under Victoria Chen's tired eyes. The wedge-shaped marks swimming across the yellowed pages of her textbook like tiny arrows pointing toward exhaustion. She blinked hard, rubbing her temples as the digital clock on her desk glowed 11:47 p.m. in accusatory red digits. Her ancient languages final was in 6 hours, and she still had 3 chapters to review on dialectical variations in Neo-Assyrian administrative texts. "Just push through," she whispered to herself in Mandarin, a habit from childhood when her parents would find her studying past midnight at the kitchen table above the restaurant. The familiar weight of expectation pressed against her chest. The full scholarship, her parents' sacrifices, the whispered comparisons to other students who seemed to navigate both academic excellence and social lives with enviable ease. Victoria's dorm room reflected her methodical nature. Color-coded notes arranged in precise stacks, linguistic charts covering one wall like academic wallpaper, and a small collection of dictionaries in languages most people couldn't even identify. Zoe's side of the room told a different story. Designer clothes draped over chairs, medical textbooks mixed with fashion magazines, photos of friends and family creating a collage of connection that Victoria envied more than she'd ever admit. The soft scratch of her pencil against paper was the only sound in the room as Victoria transcribed particularly complex verb conjugations, her mind automatically parsing the linguistic patterns that had fascinated her since childhood. At 8 years old, she'd shocked her parents by teaching herself to read their Chinese newspapers within weeks of arriving from Guangzhou. By 10, she was decoding Arabic and Russian with the same intuitive understanding that made other children naturally gifted at sports or music. A sudden metallic sound in the hallway made her pause, pencil hovering over her notes. Heavy footsteps, too measured and purposeful for college students returning from parties. Victoria's hypervigilant nature, a product of always feeling slightly out of place, made her acutely aware of sounds that didn't belong. The footsteps stopped, directly outside her door. Victoria held her breath, every muscle tensing as she heard the subtle scrape of metal against metal. Lockpicks? Her mind raced through possibilities, none of them good. Campus security used keys, and they announced themselves. Maintenance workers didn't operate at midnight without warning notices. The door opened with professional silence. 3 figures in dark tactical gear materialized in her doorway like something from a movie she'd never wanted to star in. The man leading them was tall, broad-shouldered with steel gray eyes that swept the room with military precision before settling on her with an intensity that made her shrink back in her desk chair. "Victoria Chen?" His voice was calm, authoritative, with a slight southern accent that might have been comforting in any other context. Yes." She glanced frantically toward her phone, calculating the distance and her chances of reaching it before these men could stop her. "Who are you? How did you get in here?" The man stepped forward slowly, hands visible and non-threatening despite the weapon holstered at his side. "Commander Jake Morrison, United States Navy SEALs, ma'am. I need you to listen carefully. Your country needs your help." "My country?" Victoria's voice cracked slightly. "I'm studying for finals. I think you have the wrong person." You're the linguistics prodigy who taught herself 12 languages before graduating high school, Morrison said, his eyes never leaving her face. You're the student who corrected a translation error in a 4th century Aramaic manuscript that had stumped scholars for decades. You're the only person in the continental United States who can do what we need done. The weight of his words settled on her like a physical force. Victoria felt her carefully ordered world tilting off its axis, the comfortable boundaries of academic life crumbling around her. What kind of help? The kind I can't explain here. Morrison's expression softened slightly, revealing something almost paternal beneath the tactical efficiency. Ma'am, we've intercepted communications suggesting an imminent attack on American infrastructure. The messages are written in a combination of ancient languages and modern encryption that has defeated every cryptographer in the intelligence community. We need someone who can think like a linguist and a codebreaker simultaneously. Victoria's mind reeled. But I'm just a student. I'm 18. I have finals tomorrow. Your finals will wait, one of Morrison's men said quietly. Lives won't. The stark reality of the statement hit her like cold water. Victoria looked around her room, at her carefully organized notes, her color-coded study guides, the safe academic world she'd built around herself like armor. Everything that had defined her existence suddenly seemed impossibly small. How long? She asked, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. Unknown, Morrison admitted. Could be days, could be longer. The sound of laughter and high heels in the hallway announced Zoe's return before she appeared in the doorway, stopping short at the sight of armed men in her dorm room. Her party dress and slightly disheveled appearance created a surreal contrast to the military precision surrounding Victoria. What the hell? Zoe's protective instincts flared immediately, stepping partially in front of Victoria, despite being clearly outmatched. Victoria, are you okay? Did you call them? Ms. Martinez, your roommate is needed for a matter of national security. She'll be back as soon as possible. National security? Zoe's voice pitched higher. She's a college freshman. She studies dead languages. Sometimes dead languages hold living threats, Morrison replied grimly. Victoria stood slowly, her legs unsteady. The girl who had always found security and routine and control was about to walk into a world where neither existed. She grabbed her laptop bag and stuffed in a few changes of clothes, her hands moving automatically while her mind struggled to process what was happening. Victoria, Zoe grabbed her arm. You don't have to do this. You can say no. But as Victoria met Morrison's eyes, she saw something that made her pause. Not just urgency, but a deep personal pain that spoke of losses he'd already endured. She thought of her parents, working 16-hour days at their restaurant to pay for opportunities they'd never had themselves. She thought of the weight of gifts freely given that demanded nothing in return except the courage to use them when it mattered. I'll be back, Victoria told Zoe, hoping it was true. When? Zoe demanded. Victoria looked at Morrison, who remained silent. I don't know, she admitted. As they led her from the room, Victoria caught a last glimpse of her ancient languages textbook lying open on her desk, the Sumerian cuneiform now looking less like academic exercise and more like prophecy. The door closed behind them with the soft finality of a life interrupted, leaving behind the safe world of theories and entering the dangerous realm where knowledge became a weapon and 18-year-old students became the last line of defense against catastrophe. The helicopter's rotors cut through the pre-dawn darkness as Victoria pressed her face against the small window, watching the lights of civilization disappear beneath them. The tactical vest they'd given her felt heavy and foreign, its weight a constant reminder that she was no longer in her carefully controlled academic world. Commander Morrison sat across from her, his presence both reassuring and intimidating as he monitored radio communications through his headset. The facility materialized from the Virginia countryside like something from a Cold War thriller, concrete bunkers, razor wire, and guard towers that spoke of secrets buried deep enough to require this level of protection. As they descended, Victoria caught glimpses of other aircraft, military vehicles and personnel moving with the purposeful efficiency of an anthill disturbed. "Welcome to Site 7, Morrison said as they touched down, his voice barely audible over the engine noise. "Everything you see and hear from this moment forward is classified at the highest levels. Do you understand?" Victoria nodded, though understanding felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. Her academic mind, trained to question and analyze everything, struggled with the concept of accepting information without the ability to verify or discuss it. This was antithetical to everything her education had taught her about the pursuit of knowledge. The facility's interior was a study in institutional sterility, fluorescent lighting, beige walls, and the subtle hum of air filtration systems working overtime to maintain the pristine environment required for classified work. Victoria's sneakers squeaked against polished floors as she followed Morrison through a maze of corridors lined with doors that revealed nothing about their contents. They stopped at a medical bay where a tired-looking physician administered a quick physical exam, drew blood samples, and checked her identification against files that somehow already contained her complete medical history. The efficiency was unsettling. These people knew more about her than she'd volunteered to share with anyone. "Clean bill of health," the doctor announced, stamping something into a file. "She's cleared for Level 5 access." Level 5? Victoria had no context for what that meant, but the reverent way people discussed clearance levels suggested she was being granted access to information that could change how she viewed the world. Dr. Sarah Williams materialized in the doorway like a perfectly composed force of nature, immaculately dressed despite the early hour, steel gray hair pulled into a precise bun, and eyes that missed nothing. She extended a manicured hand with the confident grip of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in any room. "Miss Chen, I'm Dr. Williams, Defense Intelligence Agency. I'll be your primary contact during this operation. I understand this is overwhelming, but I need you to focus on why you're here." They entered a briefing room dominated by wall-mounted screens, currently displaying what appeared to be random text in multiple scripts and languages. Victoria's trained eye immediately began parsing the visible elements. Fragments of Sumerian cuneiform mixed with Arabic script, Cyrillic letters, and what looked like modern English slang rendered in an unfamiliar cipher. 48 hours ago, NSA intercepts picked up these communications. Standard cryptographic analysis has failed. Linguistic experts from 3 universities have declared the combination impossible to decode systematically. Computer programs designed to break modern encryption have produced nothing but gibberish. Victoria approached the screens, her academic excitement warring with growing apprehension. The text samples were unlike anything she'd encountered. Ancient grammatical structures supporting modern terminology, dead languages pressed into service for contemporary threats. It was intellectually fascinating and terrifying simultaneously. "What makes you think I can succeed where others have failed?" she asked, though part of her was already identifying potential patterns in the character distribution. "Because you don't think like a cryptographer or a computer scientist," Dr. Williams replied. "You think like someone who understands that language is living, breathing, constantly evolving. These communications aren't just encoded, they're linguistically layered in ways that require intuitive understanding rather than systematic analysis." A younger man entered the briefing room carrying coffee and a tablet filled with additional text samples. He was Korean-American, probably early 30s, with a kind of understated confidence that suggested significant experience despite his youthful appearance. "Agent David Park, CIA liaison," he introduced himself with a warm smile that immediately put Victoria at ease. "I'll be coordinating between agencies during this operation. Dr. Williams has been telling everyone about your reputation. We're all very excited to see what you can accomplish." Victoria felt heat rise in her cheeks. The praise felt unearned, especially given the magnitude of what they were asking. "I'm just a college student. I study these languages academically, not operationally." "Academic study is exactly what we need," Park assured her, settling into a chair beside her. "Sometimes fresh perspectives see things that experience misses." Dr. Williams activated additional screens showing preliminary analysis attempts. "We believe these communications are coordinating something significant. References to timing, locations, and resources suggest a large-scale operation targeting American infrastructure." Victoria studied the samples more carefully, her mind automatically shifting into analytical mode. The Sumerian elements weren't random. They followed specific grammatical patterns that suggested someone with genuine knowledge of the language rather than simple substitution. The modern elements were woven throughout with linguistic sophistication that spoke of native fluency in multiple languages. "Whoever created this system understands both historical linguistics and contemporary encryption," she said slowly. "They're not just hiding meaning, they're creating new meaning by combining linguistic traditions that were never meant to interact." "Can you break it?" Dr. Williams asked bluntly. Victoria hesitated. Every academic instinct warned her against overpromising, but the weight of their expectation pressed against her chest like a physical force. "I can try, but I'll need access to specialized dictionaries, historical linguistic databases, and probably consultation with experts in specific dialect variations." "Whatever you need," Park assured her. "Money and resources aren't factors here." They led her to a workspace that had been prepared with remarkable attention to her academic needs. Multiple computer monitors, reference books in languages most people couldn't identify, and sophisticated analysis software that seemed designed specifically for linguistic decryption. The setup was so perfectly tailored to her working methods that it felt like stepping into an idealized version of her dorm room. As Victoria settled into the chair and began her preliminary analysis, she caught Morrison watching from the doorway. His expression was unreadable, but she sensed his discomfort with involving a civilian in whatever dangerous game they were playing. "Commander," she called out before he could leave, "what happens if I can't do this?" Morrison's jaw tightened slightly. "Then a lot of people are going to die, and we won't know where or when until it's too late." The simple honesty of his response hit harder than any dramatic speech could have. Victoria turned back to the screens, her hands trembling slightly as she began typing her first analysis notes. The ancient symbols seemed to pulse with new urgency, no longer academic exercises, but pieces of a puzzle that could determine whether thousands of people lived or died. Somewhere in these linguistic layers lay the key to preventing catastrophe, and despite her fear and inexperience, Victoria Chen was apparently the only person who could find it. Victoria's fingers moved across the keyboard with increasing confidence as dawn light filtered through the facility's reinforced windows. She had been working for 6 hours straight, her analytical mind finding unexpected comfort in the familiar rhythm of linguistic deconstruction. The coffee had gone cold hours ago, but she barely noticed. This was the kind of intellectual puzzle that made her forget basic human needs. Her workspace had evolved into organized chaos that would have horrified her neat freak roommate Zoe, but felt perfectly natural to Victoria. Reference books lay open at specific pages, sticky notes covered with transliterations and 3 different scripts created a colorful border around her monitors, and her whiteboard had become a linguistic family tree showing connections between ancient Mesopotamian dialects and modern encryption techniques. "Ma'am?" A voice interrupted her concentration. Victoria looked up to see a young man in military fatigues standing respectfully near her workstation. He was probably mid-20s, with kind eyes and the sort of easy smile that suggested someone comfortable with people despite the serious nature of his profession. "Staff Sergeant Miguel Santos, I've been assigned as your security detail." Victoria blinked, realizing she had no idea how long he had been standing there.
Security detail? Am I in danger? Santos settled into a chair beside her with the casual ease of someone accustomed to long watches. Standard procedure when civilians work on classified material. Plus, Commander Morrison wants to make sure you have everything you need. My job is to keep you safe and make sure you don't burn out before you crack this thing open. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. "Have you been watching me work?" Victoria asked, suddenly self-conscious about her intense focus and complete disregard for normal social awareness. "For about an hour," Santos admitted with a grin. "You remind me of my little sister when she's studying for medical school exams. Completely lost to the world. She's about your age, actually. Pre-med at UT Austin." The personal connection surprised Victoria. Most of the military personnel she had encountered maintained professional distance, but Santos radiated a kind of protective warmth that made her think of the older brother she had never had. "What's her name?" "Maria. She wants to be a trauma surgeon, help people in emergency situations." His expression grew more serious. "Kind of like what you're doing now, except instead of saving lives one patient at a time, you're trying to save thousands of people who don't even know they're in danger." The weight of that responsibility settled on Victoria's shoulders again, but somehow Santos's matter-of-fact delivery made it feel manageable rather than crushing. She turned back to her screens with renewed determination. "I think I'm starting to see patterns." She highlighted sections of text that had caught her attention. "The Sumerian isn't random. It's using specific, royal administrative formulaic language, the kind used for coordinating resources across multiple cities. But instead of organizing grain supplies for ancient Babylon, it's organizing something modern." She pulled up a secure communication interface and typed rapidly. "I need to contact my linguistics professor. She specializes in ancient administrative languages and might recognize specific regional variations that I'm missing." Within minutes, Professor Elena Kowalski's familiar face appeared on the secure video link, her silver hair slightly disheveled as if Victoria's call had woken her up. But her sharp blue eyes immediately focused with the intensity Victoria remembered from countless office hours. "Victoria, dear, where are you? Your roommate called me in a panic saying military personnel had taken you away."
I can't tell you where I am, Professor, but I need your expertise on Sumerian administrative language, specifically resource coordination formulas used in multi-city operations. Professor Kowalski's expression grew thoughtful. "This wouldn't happen to relate to certain linguistic patterns that surfaced during my work with government researchers in the 1980s, would it?" Victoria felt her pulse quicken. "You've seen something like this before?" During the Cold War, there were attempts to create multilingual cipher systems that would be resistant to computer decryption. The theory was that combining dead languages with living ones would create cognitive barriers that machines couldn't overcome. Most of the projects were abandoned as impractical. Professor Kowalski paused, studying Victoria's face through the screen. "But if someone has actually implemented such a system successfully?" "They have," Victoria confirmed, "and it's more sophisticated than anything I've seen in academic literature." "Share what you can within your security parameters," Professor Kowalski said. "I may be able to identify specific dialectical markers that could give you geographic or temporal clues about the system's creators." Victoria transmitted several clean text samples, watching Professor Kowalski's expression grow increasingly grave as she analyzed them. "Victoria, these administrative formulas aren't just Sumerian, they're specifically Neo-Babylonian, from the period when the empire was coordinating large-scale military campaigns. If someone is using these patterns for modern coordination—" "7 pillars," Victoria whispered, the connection suddenly blazing clear in her mind. "They're coordinating 7 simultaneous operations, major infrastructure targets that would require the same level of resource management as ancient siege warfare." Santos was already reaching for his radio. "Commander Morrison needs to hear this immediately." Victoria's fingers flew over her keyboard, now understanding the deeper structural logic of the cipher system. The ancient administrative language provided a framework for modern operational coordination, but the specific targets were encoded in the secondary layer of modern elements. As she began parsing those elements, geographic markers started emerging, references to cities, transportation hubs, and critical infrastructure nodes. Santos, I think I know when they're planning to strike. These timing markers aren't random. They're following ancient calendar systems, but translated into modern dates. If I'm reading this correctly, they've scheduled coordinated attacks for... She paused, double-checking her calculations against multiple reference sources. The answer that emerged made her blood run cold. Tomorrow. All 7 targets simultaneously during peak operational hours when casualties would be maximized. Morrison's voice crackled through Santos's radio before he could even make the call. Chen, report to the command center immediately. We're reading massive increases in signal traffic on the same communication channels. Whatever you've discovered, they know we're listening, and they're accelerating their timeline. Victoria saved her work with trembling fingers, her academic breakthrough suddenly feeling like a race against catastrophe. As she stood to follow Santos toward the command center, she caught sight of her reflection in the darkened window, no longer the overwhelmed college student who had been pulled from her dorm room, but someone who had just taken the first crucial step toward preventing mass casualties. The ancient languages that had been her academic passion were now weapons in a fight for thousands of lives. And despite her fear, Victoria Chen was finally beginning to believe she might actually be capable of winning. The command center hummed with urgent activity as Victoria entered, her breakthrough having triggered what appeared to be a full-scale military mobilization. Wall-mounted screens displayed maps of major American cities, with red dots marking potential target locations, while personnel moved between workstations, coordinating with agencies whose acronyms Victoria barely recognized. The weight of her discovery felt heavier here, surrounded by the machinery of national defense, responding to information she had decoded from ancient symbols. Commander Morrison stood at the central display, his jaw tight as he reviewed deployment options with senior officers. When he spotted Victoria, his expression shifted to something almost parental. Concern mixed with professional respect that made her feel simultaneously protected and burdened by expectation. Chen, your timeline analysis checks out. Signal intercepts show massive increases in communications over the past 2 hours. They know we're listening and they're moving to execute ahead of schedule. Dr. Williams approached with a tablet full of new intercepts, her usually composed demeanor showing cracks of stress. We need you to go deeper, Victoria. These new messages contain financial references and what appear to be international coordination codes. If we can identify funding sources and foreign connections, we might be able to disrupt their support network. Victoria settled back at her workstation, now equipped with additional monitors displaying real-time intelligence feeds. The new messages were more complex than anything she had encountered, layered with multiple encryption schemes that suggested paranoia about discovery. As she began parsing the financial codes embedded within ancient Akkadian banking terminology, a disturbing picture emerged. "This isn't just a terrorist cell," she said slowly, her voice drawing the attention of nearby analysts. "The funding patterns show wire transfers from at least 5 different countries, routed through shell companies that existed historically in ancient Mesopotamian trade networks. Someone has created a modern financial web based on 4,000-year-old commercial relationships." Agent Park appeared at her shoulder with coffee and a concerned expression. "International funding suggests state sponsorship. Can you identify which countries might be involved?" Victoria highlighted specific transaction codes that corresponded to geographic markers in the ancient texts. "The primary funding source appears to be traced through linguistic markers that correspond to modern-day Eastern Europe, specifically regions that were part of the former Soviet sphere. But there are secondary funding streams from Middle Eastern sources and what looks like logistical support from South American networks." Dr. Williams leaned over Victoria's shoulder, studying the analysis with predatory focus. "This is bigger than we thought. If multiple nation-states are coordinating against American infrastructure, we're looking at potential acts of war, not just terrorism. The implications made Victoria's hands tremble slightly as she continued decoding. This was no longer about preventing a terrorist attack. She was potentially uncovering evidence of international conspiracy against her country. The academic thrill of solving linguistic puzzles was overwhelmed by the realization that her work was exposing global threats that could reshape international relations. As evening approached, Victoria found herself struggling with homesickness that felt almost trivial compared to the magnitude of her work, yet somehow more urgent because of it. During a brief break, she requested permission to call Zoe, needing the anchor of normal human connection in a world that had become surreal. "Victoria!" Zoe's voice through the secure line was filled with relief and concern. "Are you okay? I've been worried sick. Your parents called asking if I knew where you were." "I'm fine," Victoria said, though the words felt inadequate. "I can't tell you much, but I'm helping with something important." "Important enough to miss your ancient languages final?" "Professor Kowalski said you contacted her through official channels." "Victoria, what kind of trouble are you in?" "I'm not in trouble," Victoria assured her, though she wasn't entirely certain that was true. "I'm just using my skills to help some people who need them." "Your language skills?" Zoe's voice sharpened with protective instinct. "Victoria, you're 18 years old. Whatever they're asking you to do, you don't have to sacrifice your life for it." The conversation continued for 20 minutes, Zoe providing the emotional support Victoria didn't realize she desperately needed. But her roommate's probing questions about the nature of her work made Victoria increasingly uncomfortable. The security briefings emphasized that even family and friends could inadvertently compromise operations. Yet Zoe's concern felt so genuine that Victoria found herself wanting to share details she knew she couldn't reveal. After ending the call, Victoria returned to her analysis with renewed focus, partly to distract herself from the loneliness that Zoe's voice had intensified. Working late into the night, she was surprised when Commander Morrison appeared beside her workstation with 2 cups of coffee and an expression that suggested he understood something about isolation. "Rough day?" he asked, settling into a chair beside her. Victoria accepted the coffee gratefully. "I keep thinking about how normal my life was 24 hours ago. Studying for finals, worrying about grades, wondering if I'd ever figure out how to fit in with people my own age." Morrison's expression grew distant. "I understand feeling responsible for things beyond your control. My sister was about your age when she died in the embassy bombing in Nairobi. Brilliant kid, wanted to be a diplomat. Thought she could help make the world safer through understanding instead of force." The personal revelation surprised Victoria. Throughout their interactions, Morrison had maintained professional distance, but now she glimpsed the personal motivation behind his protective instincts. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "Is that why you do this work?" "Partly, but also because sometimes understanding isn't enough. Sometimes you need people willing to stand between evil and innocent lives." He studied her face carefully. "The question is whether we have the right to ask someone like you to carry that burden." Victoria turned back to her screens where new intercepts were appearing with disturbing frequency. The timing of message transmissions seemed to correlate with the facility's shift changes and briefing schedules. Someone with access to our operational timeline was sharing information with the enemy network. She cross-referenced timestamps with personnel schedules. Her academic training and pattern recognition revealed correlations that made her stomach clench with dread. If her analysis was correct, someone within their own operation was feeding intelligence to the terrorists. Someone who knew exactly when she made breakthroughs and how close they were to preventing the attacks. Victoria stared at her findings, reluctant to voice suspicions that could destroy trust within the team, while potentially exposing a security breach that could get people killed. The ancient codes had revealed more than terrorist plans. They had uncovered a betrayal that struck at the heart of everything she had been asked to trust.
Victoria stared at her analysis for the third time, hoping the damning correlations would somehow disappear under scrutiny. They didn't. The timing patterns were too precise to be coincidental. Every major breakthrough she'd made was followed within hours by adjustments in the terrorist communications, as if someone was warning them about intelligence discoveries in real time. Her hands shook slightly as she cross-referenced the facility's personnel schedules with the suspicious transmission timestamps. The correlation was undeniable. Someone with access to classified briefings was feeding information to the enemy network. Someone she had been working alongside, trusting with her life and the lives of thousands of American civilians. The realization that danger might exist within their own walls made Victoria acutely aware of every sound in the facility. Footsteps in corridors, conversations at nearby workstations, the subtle hum of electronic equipment that might be recording more than official communications. Paranoia crept up her spine like cold fingers, transforming colleagues into potential threats and making her question every friendly gesture or supportive comment. She glanced around the command center, studying faces she had begun to trust. Dr. Williams, reviewing intelligence reports with focused intensity. Agent Park, coordinating between agencies with professional competence. Staff Sergeant Santos, maintaining his protective watch with steady reliability. Any one of them could be the source of the leak, or it could be someone she hadn't even considered suspicious. Victoria's academic training had taught her to approach problems systematically, but this situation required her to suspect people rather than analyze texts. The intellectual challenge that had initially excited her was now poisoned by the knowledge that her work was being sabotaged by someone sworn to protect American interests. When Commander Morrison returned from his latest briefing, Victoria caught his attention with a subtle gesture that she hoped appeared casual to any observers. He approached her workstation with his usual professional demeanor, but she noticed how his eyes automatically scanned the surrounding area for potential listeners. "I need to speak with you privately," Victoria said quietly, her voice barely audible above the ambient noise of the command center. Morrison's expression didn't change, but she saw recognition flash in his eyes. "Technical consultation," he announced to the room. "Conference room C in 5 minutes." The soundproof conference room felt both safer and more claustrophobic than the open command center. Victoria spread her analysis across the table, highlighting the timing correlations that had made her stomach clench with dread. Morrison studied the data with the same focused intensity she had witnessed when he evaluated tactical situations. "Someone in this facility is compromised," Victoria said bluntly. "Every time I make progress, they adjust their communications to compensate. We're not just fighting the terrorists, we're fighting someone who knows our every move." Morrison's jaw tightened as he absorbed the implications. "How certain are you about this analysis?" 97%, Victoria replied without hesitation. "The statistical probability of these correlations occurring naturally is essentially zero." Morrison was quiet for several minutes, mentally reviewing personnel files and security protocols. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of command decisions that could destroy careers and lives. "We'll implement compartmentalized information protocols. Only essential personnel will have access to your findings. I'll initiate discrete background reviews on everyone with access to classified briefings." What if the mole realizes we're investigating? They might accelerate the terrorist timeline, or worse, they might try to eliminate me to prevent further discoveries. "That's why we're keeping this between us for now," Morrison said grimly. I'll assign additional security, but we need to act normally until we can identify the source of the leak. When they returned to the command center, Agent Park immediately approached with coffee and an expression of helpful concern. "Everything all right? You looked pretty serious in there." Victoria felt her paranoia spike at his interest, though his behavior seemed perfectly natural for someone coordinating a complex operation. "Just working through some technical challenges with the linguistic patterns." "Anything I can help with?" Park offered. "I have some experience with communication security protocols that might be relevant." The offer felt both generous and potentially sinister. Victoria forced herself to smile normally while her mind cataloged every detail of Park's demeanor for later analysis. "Thanks, but I think we have it handled." Park nodded understandingly and moved on to coordinate with other analysts, leaving Victoria to wonder whether his helpfulness was genuine support or calculated positioning to gather intelligence. Every interaction now felt like a chess move in a game where she couldn't identify all the players.
Dr. Williams appeared at Victoria's workstation an hour later with new intercepts and a concerned expression. "The communication frequency has increased again. They're definitely accelerating their timeline in response to something." "Maybe they're just being cautious," Victoria suggested carefully. "Or maybe they know more about our investigation than they should," Dr. Williams replied, her sharp eyes studying Victoria's face. "I'm implementing stricter information compartmentalization. From now on, only personnel with direct operational necessity will have access to your analytical findings." The announcement felt both reassuring and ominous. Victoria appreciated the additional security, but Dr. Williams' timing made her wonder whether the intelligence officer had reached the same conclusions about internal security breaches, or whether she was positioning herself to control information flow for less patriotic reasons. As the day progressed, Victoria found herself analyzing conversations and behaviors with the same intensity she applied to ancient texts. Every casual question about her progress felt like potential intelligence gathering. Every offer of assistance seemed weighted with hidden agenda. The collaborative atmosphere that had initially impressed her was replaced with suspicious isolation that made her effectiveness suffer. Staff Sergeant Santos noticed her increasing tension during his security rounds. "You look like someone who's carrying the weight of the world," he said with gentle concern. "Want to talk about it?" Victoria studied his face, looking for signs of deception behind the genuine worry she saw there. "Just tired, I guess. This work is more intense than anything I've done before." "My sister gets the same look during medical school finals, like she's trying to solve every problem at once instead of focusing on one step at a time." The personal reference felt authentic, but Victoria's paranoia made her question whether Santos was using his sister's story to manipulate her emotions. The fact that she was doubting someone who had shown nothing but protective care made her realize how deeply the security breach had shaken her trust in basic human interactions. Late that evening, while reviewing communication intercepts for new patterns, Victoria discovered something that made her blood run cold. Hidden within the metadata of the facility's own communication systems were routing codes that matched patterns she'd identified in the terrorist cipher system. Someone wasn't just leaking information to the enemy, they were using the facility's own secure channels to coordinate with the terrorist network. The discovery meant that her suspicions were not only correct, but understated. The security breach wasn't just about leaked intelligence, it was about active collaboration between someone trusted with American national security and enemies planning mass casualties. Victoria realized she was not just uncovering a terrorist plot, but exposing a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of the intelligence community. As she prepared to document her findings, Victoria became acutely aware that her discovery put her in immediate danger. If the mole realized she'd uncovered their communication methods, they would have to choose between exposure and eliminating the threat she represented. For the first time since her extraction from Stanford, Victoria understood that her intellectual gifts might have made her not just valuable, but expendable. Victoria's fingers trembled as she traced the routing codes that had appeared in both the facility's secure communications and the terrorist cipher system. The metadata analysis was undeniable. Someone was using their own secure channels to coordinate with the enemy network, embedding instructions within routine operational communications like digital poison hidden in trusted medicine. The routing signatures led to a specific user account within the facility's system. Victoria's stomach dropped as the identity resolved on her screen. Agent David Park, CIA liaison. The helpful, reassuring presence who had brought her coffee and offered assistance was the same person systematically betraying everything they were working to protect. She sat frozen at her workstation, mind racing through every interaction with Park, recontextualizing his helpfulness as calculated positioning. His eager offers to coordinate between agencies, his interest in her analytical progress, his convenient presence during crucial moments, all of it took on sinister new meaning when viewed through the lens of espionage rather than cooperation. She glanced around the command center, spotting Park at a nearby workstation reviewing what appeared to be legitimate intelligence reports. He looked exactly like what he claimed to be, a dedicated government operative working to protect American interests. The cognitive dissonance made her question her own analysis, even as the mathematical certainty of the evidence stared back at her from multiple screens. She needed to alert Commander Morrison immediately, but Park's position in the command center meant any unusual movement or communication could tip him off. Victoria forced herself to appear focused on routine analysis while her mind worked through options for safely reporting her discovery without triggering a confrontation she was completely unprepared to handle. As if sensing her scrutiny, Park looked up from his workstation and caught her eye. His smile was the same warm, supportive expression she had found comforting over the past few days, but now it felt like a mask concealing dangerous calculation. He stood and approached her desk with coffee and what appeared to be new intercepts. "Working late again?" Park asked, settling into the chair beside her with familiar ease. "You've been putting in incredible hours. I hope Morrison is making sure you get enough rest."
"I'm fine," Victoria managed, though her voice sounded strained to her own ears. "Just trying to make sense of some new patterns I've identified." Park's expression remained pleasantly interested, but Victoria noticed his eyes flicking toward her screens with the kind of professional assessment she now realized he'd been conducting throughout their interactions. "Anything significant? The coordination team is eager for any new intelligence we can use to prevent these attacks." The casual question that would have seemed perfectly reasonable hours earlier now felt like intelligence gathering from a hostile operative. Victoria minimized her screens reflexively, an action that made Park's eyes sharpen slightly, despite his maintained smile. "Just working through some technical linguistic challenges," Victoria said, echoing the excuse she'd used earlier. "Nothing conclusive yet." Park nodded understandingly, but Victoria caught him glancing at her minimized screens with unmistakable interest. When he left to coordinate with other analysts, she noticed him making subtle hand signals that could have been routine communication or coded instructions to unknown recipients. Victoria waited until Park was engaged in conversation across the room before attempting to contact Morrison through secure channels. Her message was brief and urgent. "Need immediate private consultation. Critical security findings." She hoped the vague language would avoid triggering Park's attention while conveying the urgency of her discovery. Morrison's response came within minutes. "En route. Maintain normal operations." The military efficiency of his reply was both reassuring and ominous. He clearly understood that something significant had developed. But before Morrison could arrive, Park returned to Victoria's workstation with an expression that had shed its previous warmth. His smile was gone, replaced with something that looked almost apologetic but infinitely more dangerous. "Victoria," he said quietly, settling beside her with predatory stillness, I think we need to have a conversation. Victoria's training in pattern recognition told her that Park's demeanor had shifted into something entirely different from the helpful colleague she thought she'd known. Every muscle in her body tensed as she realized that her discovery had been discovered in turn. "About what?" she asked, proud that her voice remained steady despite the fear coursing through her system. Park glanced around the command center, ensuring their conversation wouldn't be overheard, then leaned closer with an expression that mixed regret with determination. "About what you found in those routing codes. About what you think you know regarding certain communication patterns." Victoria's blood ran cold. Park's knowledge of her specific analytical findings confirmed not only that he was the mole, but that he had been monitoring her work more closely than anyone realized. She was alone with a hostile operative who had access to classified information and unknown loyalties. "I don't know what you're talking about," Victoria said, though they both knew the denial was useless. Park's expression grew almost paternal, like a teacher disappointed in a promising student. "Victoria, you're brilliant, but you're also 18 years old and completely out of your depth. You've stumbled into something much bigger than terrorist communications or even national security. This involves international relationships, financial networks, and political considerations that extend far beyond anything they've told you." "Are you threatening me?" Victoria asked, surprised by her own directness. "I'm trying to save your life," Park replied with what seemed genuine concern. "You've discovered something that certain people would kill to protect. Your analysis threatens operations that have been years in development, involving parties who view your continued existence as an unacceptable security risk." Victoria felt the weight of his words settle around her like a suffocating blanket. "What kind of operations?" Park hesitated, as if debating how much to reveal. "Let's just say that preventing these attacks isn't necessarily in everyone's best interests. Sometimes chaos serves larger purposes. Sometimes disruption creates opportunities that stability never could." The casual way he discussed allowing terrorist attacks to proceed made Victoria's stomach lurch with revulsion. "You're talking about letting people die for political gain." "I'm talking about acceptable casualties in service of larger strategic goals," Park corrected. "Goals that your analysis could irreparably damage if you continue down this path." Victoria realized that Park was offering her a choice: disappear and stay silent, or face elimination by forces she couldn't hope to resist. The academic world that had defined her existence offered no preparation for this kind of moral complexity, where speaking truth could result in death and remaining silent could enable mass casualties. "What if I refuse?" Victoria asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Park's expression grew genuinely sad, like a teacher disappointed in a promising student. "Then I'll have to make sure your refusal doesn't compromise operations that are bigger than both of us."
The soft sound of approaching footsteps made both of them tense. Commander Morrison appeared at the edge of Victoria's workstation with an expression that immediately assessed the situation's dangerous dynamics. His hand rested casually near his sidearm as he studied Park's positioning relative to Victoria. "Agent Park," Morrison said with military courtesy that carried unmistakable warning, "I need to borrow Ms. Chen for a operational briefing." Park straightened slowly, his decision-making process visible in the calculating way he evaluated Morrison's preparedness and positioning. For a moment, Victoria thought he might attempt something desperate, but instead, he smiled with the same professional warmth that had initially gained her trust. "Of course, Commander. I was just discussing some technical challenges with our linguistic expert." Park stood and moved away from Victoria's workstation with deliberate casualness. "I'll be available if you need coordination support." As Park walked away, Victoria caught Morrison's eye and nodded almost imperceptibly. Morrison's expression didn't change, but she saw recognition flash in his eyes. He understood that the security breach had been identified and that immediate action would be required. The mole had been revealed, but Victoria realized that exposure was only the beginning of a much more dangerous game. Within 30 minutes of Park's arrest, the facility had transformed into a hurricane of coordinated activity. Victoria watched through the command center's reinforced windows as military vehicles arrived with additional security personnel, while inside, technicians swept every system for potential compromise. The revelation of internal betrayal had shattered the illusion of safety, replacing it with the grim efficiency of damage control. Commander Morrison stood at the central display, coordinating with agencies whose response capabilities Victoria was only beginning to understand. FBI counterterrorism units, NSA cyber warfare specialists, and military rapid response teams were mobilizing simultaneously across multiple time zones, all responding to intelligence that had emerged from ancient symbols she'd decoded in a university dorm room less than a week ago. "Chen, we need everything you've got," Morrison called out, his voice cutting through the operational chaos. "Park's arrest has triggered massive communication activity on the terrorist networks. They know their inside source is compromised, and they're accelerating everything." Victoria returned to her workstation with new urgency, her screens now displaying real-time intercepts that showed communication volumes spiking beyond anything they'd previously observed. The terrorists were abandoning operational security in favor of speed, creating a window of intelligence opportunity that might last only hours. As she began parsing the new communications, patterns emerged that made her blood run cold. The 7 targets weren't just infrastructure nodes. They were specifically chosen to create cascading failures that would paralyze entire regions. Power grids, transportation hubs, communication centers, and water treatment facilities, all coordinated to maximize both immediate casualties and long-term disruption. "They're not just planning attacks," Victoria announced to the command center. "They're planning to create a complete breakdown of critical services across 7 major metropolitan areas simultaneously. The economic and social impact would be catastrophic." Dr. Williams appeared at Victoria's shoulder, her usual composure replaced with focused intensity. "Can you identify the specific locations and timing?" Victoria's fingers flew across her keyboard, cross-referencing geographic markers with timing codes embedded in ancient calendar systems. Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, Houston, Phoenix, Philadelphia, and Miami. The attacks are scheduled for peak operational hours when each facility would be operating at maximum capacity. "When?" Morrison demanded. Victoria double-checked her calculations against multiple reference sources, hoping she was wrong. 18 hours from now. All 7 targets synchronized to create maximum disruption during morning rush hour on the East Coast. The timeline was impossibly tight. Even with the full resources of the American intelligence and military apparatus, preventing 7 coordinated attacks across multiple time zones would require perfect execution and considerable luck. As Victoria continued decoding operational details, her secure communications system chimed with an incoming message on a frequency that shouldn't have been accessible to external sources. The text appeared in the same multilingual cipher system she'd been working to crack, but this message was addressed specifically to her. "Brilliant work, Ms. Chen. Truly exceptional linguistic analysis." Victoria stared at the message, realizing that someone from the terrorist network was communicating directly with her through supposedly secure channels. She called Morrison immediately, showing him the impossible communication. "How did they access our secure systems?" Morrison asked, his expression darkening. Before Victoria could respond, another message appeared. "My name is Victor Kozlov. I created the cipher system you've been decoding, and I must say, your abilities exceed even my considerable expectations." Victoria felt a chill run down her spine as she realized she was in direct communication with the mastermind behind the planned attacks. "Should I respond?" she asked Morrison. "Let him talk," Morrison replied grimly. "Any intelligence we can gather might help us prevent his attacks." Victoria typed a simple response. "Who are you?" Kozlov's reply came immediately. "I am someone who appreciates exceptional talent, regardless of which side of a conflict it serves. Your linguistic abilities are remarkable, Miss Chen. It seems wasteful to use such gifts in service of a system that will never truly value your contributions." The personal nature of his communication was unsettling. Kozlov wasn't just acknowledging her abilities, he was attempting to establish a connection that felt dangerously intimate given the circumstances. "You're planning to kill thousands of innocent people," Victoria typed back. "I am planning to demonstrate the fragility of systems that people have been taught to trust without question. Sometimes destruction is necessary to create space for better alternatives. Your own government has made you complicit in conflicts you never chose to join, Miss Chen. How is that different from what I'm doing?" The philosophical argument made Victoria uncomfortable because it contained enough truth to be genuinely unsettling. She had been pulled from her normal life and thrust into a world of moral complexity that offered no clear answers, just competing loyalties and impossible choices. As she debated how to respond, another message appeared that made her stomach drop. "Your friend, Miss Martinez, is quite charming. Mexican-American, pre-med student, approximately 5'6" with dark hair and concerned brown eyes. She's been asking many questions about your disappearance." Victoria's blood turned to ice as the implications hit her. "You have Zoe?" "I have insurance," Kozlov replied. "Your continued cooperation ensures her continued well-being. I also have your linguistics professor, Dr. Kowalski, who was surprisingly easy to locate given her academic prominence." Morrison read the messages over Victoria's shoulder, his expression growing increasingly grim. "He's using your personal connections as leverage." Victoria's hands trembled as she typed, "What do you want?" "I want you to stop interfering with operations that are bigger than your understanding allows. Your linguistic abilities have caused considerable disruption to carefully laid plans. However, I'm prepared to offer you a choice." Victoria waited, dreading whatever ultimatum was coming. "Join me willingly, and your friends remain safe, while you learn to use your gifts for purposes greater than maintaining a status quo that serves only the powerful. Continue working against me and discover how quickly exceptional talent becomes a liability when it threatens the wrong interests." The ultimatum was elegant in its simplicity. Betray everything she'd been working for, or watch her friends pay the price for her dedication to preventing mass casualties. Victoria realized that Kozlov had identified her greatest weakness and was exploiting it with surgical precision. "He's forcing you to choose between saving thousands of strangers and protecting people you love," Morrison observed quietly. Victoria stared at the screen, her mind racing through options that all seemed to end in tragedy. The ancient languages that had been her academic passion had led her into a moral labyrinth where every path forward required sacrificing something essential to who she was. "I need to see proof that they're alive," Victoria typed, hoping to buy time while her mind worked through impossible calculations of loyalty and responsibility. Kozlov's response included video footage of Zoe tied to a chair in what appeared to be an abandoned warehouse, her eyes wide with fear but defiant even in captivity. A second video showed Professor Kowalski in similar circumstances, her academic composure intact despite obvious distress. "You have 4 hours to decide," Kozlov's final message read. "After that, your friend's well-being becomes dependent on variables beyond my control." Victoria stared at the images of the two people who meant more to her than her own safety, realizing that her exceptional gifts had made her not just valuable, but a target
whose greatest weakness was her capacity to care about other people. The brilliant student who had been recruited to save thousands now faced choosing between her moral convictions and the lives of those she loved most. The abandoned warehouse in Baltimore's industrial district squatted against the gray dawn sky like a monument to economic decay. Victoria sat in the passenger seat of Morrison's tactical vehicle, watching the building through binoculars while her heart hammered against her ribs. Somewhere inside that deteriorating structure, Zoe and Professor Kowalski were being held by a man who viewed their lives as acceptable collateral damage in a war she was only beginning to understand.
"Remember, you're not alone in there," Morrison said quietly, adjusting the nearly invisible communication device hidden beneath Victoria's jacket collar. "We'll be monitoring everything, and the moment you give us the signal, we move in." Victoria nodded, though her mouth felt too dry to speak. The past 2 hours had been spent in tactical planning sessions that felt surreal. Military personnel discussing entry points and neutralization strategies, while she tried to prepare for intellectual combat with someone whose philosophical justifications for mass murder were as sophisticated as her own academic training. "What if I can't outsmart him?" Victoria asked, voicing the fear that had been gnawing at her confidence. "He created the cipher system I've been struggling to decode. He's probably been planning this conversation as carefully as he planned the attacks." "Then you'll have to become someone you've never been before," Morrison replied with quiet intensity. "You'll have to trust that your intelligence is more than just academic knowledge. It's a weapon when you need it to be." Victoria stepped out of the vehicle and walked toward the warehouse alone, each footstep echoing in the empty industrial landscape. The building's loading dock stood open like a mouth, revealing darkness that could conceal any number of threats. As she approached, she forced herself to think like the linguistic analyst she'd trained to be. This confrontation was just another text to decode, another pattern to unravel. The warehouse interior was a cavern of shadows and decay, with shafts of morning light cutting through broken windows to illuminate dust motes that danced like suspended punctuation marks. Victoria's footsteps echoed in the emptiness until she spotted them, Zoe and Professor Kowalski tied to chairs in the center of the space, both alive but clearly terrified. "Victoria!" Zoe called out, her voice mixing relief with desperate warning. "It's a trap! He's been waiting for you!" A slow clap echoed from the warehouse's depths as Viktor Kozlov emerged from the shadows. He was smaller than Victoria had imagined, perhaps 50 years old, with intelligent gray eyes and the kind of understated presence that made him forgettable in crowds, but dangerous in isolation. His appearance was deceptively ordinary, like a college professor or government analyst rather than an international terrorist. "Ms. Chen," Kozlov said with genuine warmth, as if greeting a respected colleague. "Thank you for coming. I apologize for the dramatic staging, but I needed to ensure our conversation wouldn't be interrupted by well-meaning but ultimately counterproductive military intervention." Victoria forced herself to walk closer, noting the precise placement of everything in the space, her friends positioned where she could see them clearly, Kozlov positioned where he could retreat if necessary, and multiple exit routes that suggested extensive advance planning. "Let them go," Victoria said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "They're innocent civilians." "Innocent?" Kozlov's eyebrows rose with genuine curiosity. "Your friend, Miss Martinez, is studying to become a medical professional in a system that prioritizes profit over healing. Your professor has spent her career decoding dead languages, while living languages die from neglect and political suppression. How exactly does innocence factor into those choices?" The question was delivered with the kind of intellectual sophistication that made Victoria realize she was facing someone whose mind worked on her own level, someone who genuinely believed his actions were justified by philosophical frameworks as complex as her own academic training. "They're trying to help people," Victoria replied. "Zoe wants to save lives. Professor Kowalski preserves knowledge that would otherwise be lost forever. And I'm trying to prevent a much larger catastrophe by demonstrating the fragility of systems that people trust without question. Your government recruited an 18-year-old civilian for military operations, Ms. Chen. How is using your intellectual gifts for their purposes different from me asking you to use them for mine?" Victoria felt the ground shifting beneath her moral certainty. Kozlov's argument contained enough truth to be genuinely unsettling. She had been pulled from her normal life and thrust into a world of moral complexity that offered no clear answers. "The difference is that you're planning to murder thousands of innocent people," Victoria said, though she heard uncertainty creeping into her voice. "I'm planning to expose the illusion of security that keeps people passive while their leaders make decisions that affect millions without consultation or accountability," Kozlov replied with patient intensity. "Sometimes disruption is necessary to create space for better alternatives." Victoria realized that Kozlov was attempting more than just recruitment. He was trying to genuinely convert her to his worldview through philosophical argument rather than simple coercion. The respect implicit in his approach was almost more unsettling than direct threats would have been. "You created an impossible cipher system, combining ancient Sumerian with modern encryption, historical administrative language with contemporary operational codes. It's brilliant work." Kozlov's expression brightened with genuine pride. "Thank you. It required years of development combining my intelligence background with linguistic research that most people would consider purely academic. Very few people could appreciate the theoretical elegance involved."
The Neo-Babylonian administrative formulas were particularly inspired, Victoria continued, watching his reaction carefully. "Using resource coordination templates from siege warfare to organize modern infrastructure attacks. But there's something I don't understand about the temporal encoding system." She moved closer as she spoke, ostensibly out of academic enthusiasm, but actually positioning herself where Morrison's team would have clearer lines of sight if they needed to intervene. Kozlov seemed genuinely engaged in the intellectual discussion, his guard lowering slightly as he responded to what appeared to be professional appreciation of his work. "The temporal encoding was the most challenging aspect," Kozlov admitted, his voice taking on the tone of a professor explaining a complex concept. "Ancient calendar systems don't translate directly to modern scheduling, so I had to create conversion algorithms that maintained operational security while allowing precise coordination." Victoria nodded enthusiastically while her mind worked through the implications of what he was revealing. If she could understand his temporal encoding system completely, she might be able to disrupt the coordination between terrorist cells, even if she couldn't prevent Kozlov from executing his immediate threats. "The mathematical relationships between Mesopotamian lunar cycles and modern time zones must have been incredibly complex to work out," Victoria said, genuinely impressed despite the circumstances. "It took 18 months of development," Kozlov replied with obvious satisfaction, "but the result was a system that could coordinate operations across multiple continents while remaining essentially unbreakable to anyone without both advanced linguistic knowledge and historical mathematical understanding." As he spoke, Victoria caught a subtle hand signal from the shadows near the warehouse entrance. Morrison's team was in position. She needed to keep Kozlov talking while positioning herself and her friends for a rescue operation that would require perfect timing and considerable luck. "Could you show me how the conversion algorithms work?" Victoria asked, with academic enthusiasm that wasn't entirely feigned. "I understand the theoretical framework, but the practical implementation must have required insights I haven't considered." Kozlov studied her face carefully,
and Victoria realized he was evaluating whether her interest was genuine intellectual curiosity or tactical maneuvering. His next words would determine whether she could continue the deception or whether the confrontation was about to turn violent in ways she was completely unprepared to handle. Kozlov's moment of hesitation was all Morrison's team needed. The warehouse erupted in coordinated chaos as tactical operatives emerged from concealed positions, their movements precise and overwhelming. Victoria threw herself toward her friends as flashbang grenades detonated, temporarily blinding and disorienting everyone in the cavernous space. When the ringing in her ears subsided and her vision cleared, Kozlov was on the ground in restraints, his philosophical composure replaced by the grim resignation of someone whose carefully laid plans had crumbled. Zoe and Professor Kowalski were being freed by medics, both shaken but unharmed, their relief visible even through the tactical chaos surrounding them. "Victoria!" Zoe grabbed her in a fierce hug that conveyed months of worry compressed into desperate minutes. "I thought we were going to die in here. What is going on? Who are these people?" Before Victoria could answer anything, Morrison's radio crackled with urgent communications from multiple agencies. His expression grew increasingly grim as he listened to reports flooding in from intelligence centers across the country. "Chen, we've got a problem," Morrison announced, his voice cutting through the warehouse's echoing aftermath. "The terrorist cells aren't waiting for further instructions. They're executing their attacks on predetermined schedules." Victoria felt her stomach drop as the implications hit her. Decentralized command structure. Even with the leader captured, the individual cells continue operating according to preset parameters. "How long do we have?" Dr. Williams' voice came through Morrison's radio, transmitted from the command center where she was coordinating the broader response. Victoria's mind raced through the timing calculations she decoded earlier. "Based on the synchronization protocols I identified, approximately 4 hours until the first wave of attacks during East Coast morning rush hour." Morrison was already coordinating with his team to transport Kozlov and the rescued hostages back to the facility. "We need you back at your workstation immediately. If these cells are operating on automatic protocols, you're the only one who might be able to send stand-down orders in Kozlov's own cipher system." The helicopter ride back to Site 7 was a blur of urgent radio communications and tactical coordination. Victoria found herself sitting across from Kozlov, who remained silent but watchful, his intelligent eyes studying her with what appeared to be professional respect rather than animosity. "You played that conversation very skillfully," Kozlov said quietly, his voice barely audible over the helicopter's engines. "Using genuine intellectual curiosity to mask tactical maneuvering. Most people your age would have relied on emotional appeals or moral arguments."
Victoria studied his face, seeing something almost paternal in his expression despite the circumstances. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because stopping my operations will require you to think like me, not like the people who recruited you," Kozlov replied with disturbing calm. "The terrorist cells are operating according to protocols I designed to be resistant to external interference. They will execute their missions unless they receive stand-down orders in very specific linguistic formulations that prove the communications are coming from me personally." Morrison leaned forward with intense focus. "What kind of linguistic formulations?" Kozlov's smile was enigmatic. "The kind that Miss Chen will need to decode from the patterns she's already identified, then reproduce with sufficient authenticity to convince 7 independent terror cells that I am ordering them to abort their missions." The challenge was intellectually staggering. Victoria would need to not only understand Kozlov's communication methods completely, but also replicate his linguistic signature well enough to fool operatives who had been trained to recognize subtle deception. Back at the facility, Victoria established herself at multiple workstations simultaneously, her screens displaying real-time intelligence feeds from all 7 target locations. FBI surveillance teams had identified the terrorist cells' positions, but any direct intervention would likely trigger immediate attacks rather than preventing them. Sergeant Santos positioned himself at Victoria's primary workstation, coordinating between her analytical work and the law enforcement teams preparing to move on her signal. His presence was both reassuring and a stark reminder of how many lives depended on her ability to essentially become Kostlov linguistically. The stand-down protocols aren't just encrypted, they're psychologically encoded to reflect Kostlov's specific cognitive patterns. Each terrorist cell has been trained to recognize not just his linguistic choices, but his thought processes expressed through written communication. Dr. Williams reviewed Victoria's preliminary analysis with growing concern. Can you replicate that level of psychological authenticity? Victoria studied the communication samples she'd captured during her confrontation with Kostlov, looking for patterns that went deeper than vocabulary or grammar. I think so. His intellectual arrogance is actually an advantage. He uses very specific philosophical frameworks to justify his actions, and those frameworks create predictable linguistic patterns. Working with captured communication equipment that had been taken from Park's apartment, Victoria began crafting messages to each terrorist cell. The process required her to think like someone whose brilliant mind had been twisted by disillusionment and ideological extremism, channeling philosophical sophistication toward destructive ends. The first message took her 45 minutes to compose, checking every word choice against Kostlov's psychological profile and linguistic patterns. When she transmitted it to the Los Angeles cell, the response came back within minutes. Authorization confirmed. Operation suspended pending further instructions. It worked, Santos reported with barely contained excitement. LA team is standing down. Victoria's confidence grew as she adapted the successful formula to the remaining 6 cells, each message requiring subtle modifications to account for different operational contexts while maintaining the essential psychological authenticity that would convince trained operatives who had been trained to recognize subtle deception. One by one, the terrorist cells responded with confirmation of operational suspension. Chicago, New York, Houston, Phoenix, Philadelphia. Each successful stand-down order felt like a small miracle of intellectual precision under impossible pressure. The final message to the Miami cell required the most delicate handling, as intelligence reports suggested this group was the most suspicious of unexpected communications. Victoria spent an additional 20 minutes refining the psychological nuances, ensuring that every element reflected Kostlov's specific cognitive patterns. When the Miami cell's confirmation came through, operations suspended, awaiting revised strategic assessment, the command center erupted in restrained celebration. 7 major terrorist attacks had been prevented through linguistic analysis rather than military force, saving potentially thousands of lives through the precise application of academic knowledge. Victoria collapsed back in her chair, emotionally and intellectually exhausted, but filled with a sense of accomplishment unlike anything she'd experienced in academic settings. She had proven that exceptional intellectual gifts could serve purposes far beyond personal achievement when combined with the support and trust of others. Morrison approached her workstation with an expression that mixed professional respect with personal admiration. Outstanding work, Chen. You just prevented one of the most sophisticated terrorist operations in American history. As law enforcement teams moved to apprehend the 7 terrorist cells simultaneously, Victoria realized that her academic passion for ancient languages had evolved into something far more significant: a weapon against chaos, a tool for protecting innocent lives, and proof that intellectual dedication could serve the greater good when circumstances demanded extraordinary courage. The brilliant student who had been reluctantly extracted from her dorm room had become someone capable of thinking like her enemies while maintaining her moral center, using her exceptional gifts not just for personal achievement, but for the protection of others. 3 weeks after preventing 7 coordinated terrorist attacks, Victoria Chen sat in her Stanford dorm room staring at an ancient languages textbook that might as well have been a different language. Written in a foreign language she'd never learned. The Sumerian cuneiform that had once fascinated her now seemed impossibly trivial. Academic exercises, divorced from the life-and-death urgency that had given similar symbols meaning beyond anything her professors could imagine. Zoe burst through the door, carrying coffee and wearing the kind of determinedly cheerful expression that had become her default since Victoria's return. Ready for Professor Martinez's lecture on comparative mythology? I hear he's covering Mesopotamian creation stories today. Victoria closed the textbook with a soft thud that seemed to echo her internal disconnect from academic life. I think I need to skip class again today. Victoria, you've missed half your classes since you got back, Zoe said with gentle firmness, settling on her bed with a concerned expression of someone who had witnessed her roommate's mysterious disappearance and equally mysterious return. I know whatever happened during those 2 weeks was intense, but you can't just disconnect from everything that made you who you are. The irony was that Victoria felt more connected to who she truly was than ever before, but that person no longer fit comfortably within the boundaries of normal college life. How could she explain analyzing ancient administrative formulas for a midterm exam felt meaningless when she'd used similar skills to prevent mass casualties? How could she pretend that academic achievement mattered when she'd proven her abilities in ways that would remain classified for decades? I keep thinking about responsibility, Victoria said, surprising herself with the admission. Before, I studied these languages because I found them intellectually fascinating. Now I know they can be used to save lives or enable mass destruction, and that changes everything about how I approach them. Zoe sat beside her with the kind of patient attention that had made their friendship possible, despite their dramatically different backgrounds. You know you can tell me what really happened, right? I won't judge you or think you're crazy, whatever it was. Victoria met her friend's eyes, seeing the genuine concern there. I can't tell you specifics, but I can tell you that I learned my abilities aren't just academic curiosities. They're tools that can serve purposes far beyond getting good grades or impressing professors. That sounds like it would be exciting, Zoe said carefully. It was terrifying, Victoria replied honestly, and it made me realize that exceptional abilities come with exceptional responsibilities, whether you want them or not. A knock on the door interrupted their conversation, and Victoria opened it to find Professor Kowalski standing in the hallway with the kind of understanding expression that suggested she knew more about Victoria's recent absence than official explanations would indicate. "May I come in?" Professor Kowalski asked. "I think we need to have a conversation about using one's gifts responsibly." They settled around Victoria's desk while Professor Kowalski poured tea from a thermos she'd brought, her movements deliberate and calming. "Victoria, I've spent my career studying dead languages, and I've learned that knowledge carries weight beyond its immediate applications. What happened to you, whatever it was, has clearly shown you that academic gifts can serve larger purposes." Victoria nodded, grateful that someone understood without requiring detailed explanations she couldn't provide. "The question," she continued, "is whether you'll let that knowledge paralyze you or inspire you to approach your studies with deeper purpose. Your abilities aren't diminished by serving others, they're refined by it." Over the following hour, Professor Kowalski helped Victoria work through the psychological adjustment that came with understanding the real-world applications of her academic passion. The conversation was both therapeutic and intellectually stimulating, reminding Victoria that her scholarly pursuits had value even when they weren't preventing national catastrophes. 2 days later, Victoria was reviewing linguistic analysis methods in the library when someone settled into the chair across from her. She looked up to find Commander Morrison in civilian clothes, his military bearing obvious despite his casual appearance. "How are you adjusting?" Morrison asked quietly,
his voice carrying the same protective concern she remembered from their most dangerous moments together. "It's harder than I expected. Everything feels different now. I understand what I'm capable of, but I don't know how to balance that with wanting a normal life." Morrison nodded with understanding that came from personal experience. "After my first combat deployment, I couldn't relate to people who worried about everyday problems. It felt like they were living in a different world from the one that I had seen." "How did you handle it?" "I learned that both worlds are real, and both matter. The skills you developed working with us don't disappear when you're studying for finals, and the person you were before doesn't become invalid because of what you've accomplished since then." They talked for an hour about integration, responsibility, and the challenge of maintaining personal identity while accepting the obligations that came with exceptional capabilities. When Morrison left, he handed her a business card with only a phone number.
If you ever decide you want to use your gifts to serve others again, call me. But if you never want to leave this campus again, that's equally valid. The choice is yours, and it always will be. That evening, Victoria called her parents for the first time since her return, knowing she owed them an explanation for her mysterious absence that wouldn't compromise classified operations or worry them beyond reason. "I was selected for a special academic program," she told them in Mandarin, the familiar language providing comfort during a difficult conversation. "I can't discuss the details, but I had the opportunity to use my language skills to help some people who needed them." Her mother's voice carried the mixture of pride and concern that had defined Victoria's entire academic career. "Are you safe? Are you happy?" "I'm safe," Victoria assured her, "and I'm learning what happiness means when you understand that your abilities can serve purposes larger than personal achievement." Later that night, Victoria and Zoe talked until dawn about responsibility, friendship, and the challenge of growing up faster than expected while maintaining connections to the people and experiences that provided emotional grounding. "I need you to know that whatever happened changed me," Victoria told her roommate. "I'm still the same person who studies too much and overthinks everything, but I also know now that I might be called upon to help people in ways I never expected." "Will you tell me if that happens again?" Zoe asked. "I'll tell you as much as I can," Victoria promised. Over the following weeks, Victoria established a new routine that honored both aspects of her identity: the dedicated student who found intellectual joy in ancient languages, and the young woman who had proven capable of preventing mass casualties through precise application of her knowledge. She threw herself into her studies with renewed purpose, understanding that every skill she developed could potentially serve others when circumstances demanded. When final exams arrived, Victoria approached her ancient languages test with perspective that would have been impossible before her classified mission. The academic challenge was meaningful not because it determined her grade, but because it refined abilities that had already proven their worth in protecting innocent lives. As she wrote her analysis of Neo-Babylonian administrative formulas, she smiled slightly, remembering when similar texts had held the key to preventing terrorist attacks. The knowledge that her academic passion could serve such vital purposes gave every study session deeper meaning, transforming personal achievement into preparation for unknown future challenges. Victoria Chen had learned to balance exceptional talent with normal life, accepting the responsibility that came with her gifts while preserving the relationships and experiences that made that responsibility worthwhile. She remained ready to serve when called upon, but equally committed to living fully when that service wasn't required. The brilliant student who had been reluctantly extracted from this same room weeks earlier had returned as someone who understood that exceptional abilities were most meaningful when they protected the ordinary joys that made life worth defending. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.